The summer in England sees a great migration from town to country. People go to get away from city life to the grassy fields and shady lanes. Although most people enjoy themselves, there are some like this girl who are not so happy. They suffer from what is commonly known as hay fever. Their eyes irritate, their noses run, and they sneeze. This girl's pollen sensitivity has been confirmed by skin tests. Each syringe contains testing fluid from a different pollen. The result is measured 15 minutes later.
This is Dr. William Frankland in 1953, narrating a documentary film about hay fever. And it's thanks to this man that we know so much about this pesky allergy and why we see pollen counts on our weather forecast today. Dr. Frankland devoted his career to the field of allergy research, not officially retiring until the remarkable age of 100 years old. However, before these prolific years, his job during the Second World War was at the Army Medical Corps, 3.5 brutal years of which was spent as a prisoner of war of the Japanese. Today, Dr. Frankland lives and works in one room. I got the chance to pay him a visit.
I remember the First World War quite well, in fact, because my father went away. And what I remember is him coming back, and what a joyful thing was when he came back from France.
Did he talk about his experiences in the war?
No, almost no, but all I remember when he was in Alexandria and Cairo, he sent lovely postcards to us of the Sphinx and the pyramids, and I love these. I still remember them coming, and I thought, this is marvelous. He had a Sam Brown, which I don't say wear them now, but I was very proud. I took it from him, and I have pictures of me wearing it in uniform. What's happened to it, I don't know, but...
So his webbing, you wore his webbing from the First World War into the Second World War?
Yes, I did. I was born an identical twin. They were twins, and very premature. I weighed 3 pounds, 1 ounce, and in those days, the chances of living when you're so premature and so small were small, but I lived. I was lucky, as it were, but people always ask me, how have I lived so long? And I just say, luck, luck, luck. I've been so near death so many times, but I've always just escaped, and that's why I'm alive. When I qualified, and I did a job at St. Mary's Hospital, people don't seem to realize that as far as the national health is concerned, that you weren't paid anything at all for 6 months. And I did a locum in a psychiatric hospital, and I was there for 5 months and thoroughly enjoyed it. And then I thought, with what was happening politically, there's going to be war. So when September came along, I went back to my old army hospital, which I'd done previous locums, where they actually paid you a pound a day. And so I arrived there on September the 1st. War started on September the 3rd. And I remember that very well, because all the regular doctors and other people all left, and I was left on my own with a vast number of beds, an isolation hospital. And I was working 16 hours a day, but after exactly 2 years, 1 year, I was on the way to what I thought was the Middle East. But in fact, when we got to Cape Town, that's right, most of the convoy of all the vessels and things went to the Middle East, and a small group went to Singapore, and I was on that group.
And you got to Singapore just in time for the Japanese to invade?
Well, in fact, it was very interesting, having been bombing of London and Coventry and so on, that when you got to Singapore, all lights were on, and there was no sign that there was a war going on anywhere. and this was actually exactly 7 days before Pearl Harbor.
And so was Singapore quite fun initially?
Well, yes, it was, and I was taken to the cricket club to show how they'd played there for years and years and years, and you just enjoyed yourself. On the third day, I and another medical officer were just told to go to an Indian field hospital or something like that. Then an officer came from the headquarters in Singapore and said, "You two people must now do some work." And this is just before the war. The war was 3 days away, I think. And he said, there are two hospitals. One's called Tangling Military Hospital, and it was dermatology and BD, and the other is the Alexander Military Hospital, which I always said looked a little like Buckingham Palace. It was a vast place. It was a main hospital. And there you'll be in the minor operation room for giving an anesthetic to patients. And I said, well, I'm a very bad anaesthetist. I don't want to go there, and I like the skin complaints and things like that. I want to go there. And the other doctor said the same. So what happened? This officer took a coin out and said, "Franklin, call," as he spun the coin, and it was heads. And so I went where I went. And that doctor that went into the other place was horribly murdered on the 14th of February 1942. So there's on the spin of a coin, that's the first time I had a real narrow escape. And so it went on all my life. But I still remember the day, it was a Sunday at night, the Japanese, besides the Pearl Harbor, they sent 3 bombers to Singapore, and they dropped their bombs, ready to say, we've started war. But one of the bombs, have you ever heard a bomb coming down?
No.
And so on? I heard this bomb coming down, and I thought the plane was overhead, and it was the only time in my whole war experience that I very quickly went under my bed, just thinking that it might be hitting me. In fact, it arrived incredibly close, so it was, I was lucky, as it were. They were coming down all the time, and I thought, even in the very early days, well, I'm going to not get out of this.
Oh, really?
Oh, yes.
So your commanding officers sort of dismissed the Japanese. They just said they were inferior and there's nothing to worry about.
Yes, to begin with. And you learned within a few days that this was when you saw their fighter planes, and they just were so good in shooting down our defense of Singapore. It wasn't impregnable, you see. The reason they fought so well was that if they died fighting, they went to 2 layers higher in heaven than you can in any other way. And if they were taken prisoners, they wouldn't be allowed to go back to Japan or anything like that. And people don't realize, how many prisoners did we take in the whole campaign? Well, I know we had 4 Japanese prisoners, and I looked after them in the military hospital. And they didn't want to live. And 3 of them were paratroopers and had been picked up unconscious, and one of them had met an officer at close quarters in the jungle, and they both fired a pistol. And this man had a wound which, in fact, he had a collapsed lung, and the bullet had just hit the edge of his heart, and so on. And later it all got infected. I remember this particular Japanese, who not one of the paratroopers, he said, you're trying to keep me alive. I don't want to be kept alive. And I said, no, that's my duty. I'll do that. So we took the whole of that campaign 4 Japanese prisoners, and they in fact, finally got away to Colombo, yes.
When the war spread to the Far East, Singapore knew, of course, that the Straits Settlements and all Malaya would be in the thick of it. Singapore's first blitz came within a few hours of the opening of hostilities from Japanese planes off an aircraft carrier. And a number of bombs falling in a Chinese district of the city caused much havoc and many casualties among the civil population.
What do you remember of the fighting? Did you witness it, or were you locked away with the casualties?
No, neither. I wasn't a surgeon, I was a physician, and I was looking after various people at the time. And they were very successful, having landed in Singapore, and finally they had long-distance mortars, and the mortars could reach us. So the front line of the Japanese was very close to me. And I finally left there, but I was in the last lorry that actually left where the lorry came from. But I still remember the driver. He was a local driver, and he didn't have shoes or socks. And of course the mortars were coming on the road that we were on. You saw just in front of you a sort of a hole appear in the road with some smoke, and this was one of the mortars. And we hoped we wouldn't get hit. So he said, instead of going slowly, I was going fast. And the most terrifying journey I've ever been. And I still remember seeing his big toe, on the accelerator, went down as far as it would go. But we bumped back through, and I finished up on right on the sort of far side of Singapore Island, and had my own hospital there.
Tell me about the surrender to the Japanese. When did you hear about it?
Well, the surrender was on the 15th of February 1942, but by Black Friday, Friday the 13th of February 1942, they were well through into the Singapore city, and they were in charge of the reservoirs and the water, and so water was getting extremely scarce and got more scarce later on. And it's very annoying when you've only got what was in your water bottle, and that had to last you for 2 or 3 days. I have to say that was the day that I was officially, as it were, a prisoner of war. I didn't see a Japanese for 15 days. They were quickly they went on to Sumatra and Java, and they had no plans that they could take 120,000 soldiers. What were we going to do with them? And so they had to make plans there and then. And I was in my Fulton buildings and didn't go out to the main camp, which were the Indians, the Australians, and the British were at Changi, until it was 14th or 15th day. It was 17 miles, and had immediately given a job to look after the sick and so on.
And when did it become clear that this was going to be a pretty brutal experience as a prisoner of war?
Well, the main thing that happened in the early days, and certainly subsequently, we had a very, very poor diet. And the main thing that you thought about when you're starving, and this happened very, very quickly, food, 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 and what was going to happen to you, and so on. And we didn't hear about all the atrocities on the railway, the death railway, which I was in fact down to go on, and 3,000 people who had to suddenly leave it and go in this terrible journey up towards Thailand. It's only when the people came back from down from the railway when it was all given up, we heard about all the atrocities. But the other thing is, if you tried to escape, they said you would be shot. Although we were in prison, there was nothing to stop you trying to escape. And every now and again, first lot of 5 people tried to escape. Where were you going to go? You had to cross the sea into Johor Bahru, where jungle and tigers and things, and how could you live? Anyhow, they were all shot. 5 of them were shot. And then about 6 months later, another 5 people came, and 3 of them were shot, but 2, and they got through onto the mainland of Malaya, but 2 of them were trying to get back to safety in the prisoner of war camp, and one of them was slashed by a Japanese sword. The officers always had their family sword, and it left his arm hanging useless with a little bit of skin. And he actually got back, and another one got back. How he got back to safety, I don't know. But the Japanese looked upon him as someone that was very, very lucky, and he'd done the impossible thing and tried to escape, and there was only one answer to that: shoot him. So I treated him. When I got him, he couldn't walk, he couldn't do anything. He was just a skeleton. But after 2 months, I finally said, in 3 days' time, you can go back to your unit, because he could walk then and so on. But what happened? He competed the awful Japanese police. One man came along, and he came along to me, as it were, and this man, as I was looking after, and he got hold of the man and he said, go outside and dig your own grave. Well, he was too weak to do that, but they had he had brought with him a Sikh, and they were made to dig it. And then the next thing, the policeman said, you can shoot this man. They were asked to shoot their ex-friends and so on. And
so it's a firing squad of his own mates.
Yeah, but these are the Sikhs. So the competing man was so cross that he came up and just shot him in the back of the head with a pistol and pushed him into the grave, and the Sikhs had to fill up the grave and things. So that was, as far as very personal as far as I was concerned, because when you've been with a man every day for 2 weeks, for 2 months, you get to know them and so well, and just when he's taken from you and just very, 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 very near you, he's shot. These things are not very pleasant.
On the 12th of June 2018, present-day Sentosa, a small island off the coast of Singapore, played host to Donald Trump and Kim Jong-un. While the island's contemporary name translates as peace and tranquility, its previous label told a very different story. Till as late as 1972, the island was known as Pulau Belakang Mati, variously translated as Island of Death from Behind.
I finished up on an island just south of Singapore Island called, in those days, Blakamati, and it's now Sentosa, and it's 5-star hotels, but in my day it was largely jungle, except for the big guns to fire at, as everyone thought that the enemy would come by sea from the south. No, they came the other way. If the men misbehaved in any way, this was nearly always, there were various labour parties, and from 1 to 15 to go out and dealing largely with bombs at the harbour. But if any of our men stole or was caught doing something, we as officers were told by the Japanese, you aren't looking after them properly. So we were all lined and bashed. Now, in some accounts they say, was slapped on the face. No, you were bashed with a fist and so on. And then one of these, in fact, yes, it was my last. I was bashed, and I never felt a thing. I went unconscious. How long I was out unconscious, I don't know, but eventually I got up, and I was told all about this later on. I slowly walked towards the officer, Japanese officer who had bashed me, with my clenched fist, and the little Japanese private just near him was just going to put his bayonet through me. For some reason, I don't know what reason it was, the Japanese officer said no. And that was that. And later on, I went back. Finally, I could walk, and I can't remember anything for, I don't know how long it was, but minutes or something. And I said to my commanding officer, well, that's the best bashing I've ever had in my life, because I never felt a thing. But I've just spat out a molar, so I know I've been bashed. And he said, "Oh, doctor, we thought we'd lost you." And I said, "Why?" And he told me what had happened about this, the way I'd got up and it looked as though I was going to hit the Japanese officer, which was certain death, I must admit. So why did that Japanese officer put his hand up, or his arm up, and stop the private? I don't know. Another lucky escape.
That's the atomic bomb exploding at Nagasaki. The film was taken in a B-29 many miles away. All of you who see this picture can judge for yourselves the extent of the menace to civilization of this new weapon. Civilized people can only demand that such power be directed not towards their obliteration, but to the benefit of mankind.
The atom bomb saved my life because the Emperor of Japan had said that if the Americans, who had now run over the Philippines, the next thing they were going to do was to invade Japan. If the Americans started doing anything on the mainland of Japan, all the prisoners of war, wherever they were, whether they were in Japan or were Singapore or were Black Magic, where I was in Java, all over the world, they all had to be shot on that day. And we knew that at the parade ground that we had where I was, one night we heard something going on. In the morning, and this was about 2 weeks before the end of the war, there were 3 obvious machine gun places, and we knew what was going to happen to us, but we didn't know why. So when the atom bombs dropped, that actually saved my life, because I was going to be shot as the Americans were going to definitely land in Japan.
Where were you when you found out that the Japanese had surrendered and that you were going to survive this experience? Do you remember that moment?
Yes, very much so. I was in Rakamati, and all the people were who weren't supposed to talk to us at all were joyfully talking to us and saying the war was over. In fact, in the southeast, the war wasn't over. They wouldn't capitulate for 5 days, so we were still at risk for the next 5 days after what was called the end of the war. But finally, they capitulated, and we said, and the total calories, I can't remember what they were now, but we were starving and there was hardly any food available at all. And we said we wanted to go back to the security of Singapore Island and so on. And we were allowed to do that the next morning. Off we set, crossed onto Singapore, and got to this place, Kranji, and it was just next, where we were put, was next to this permanent hospital that the Japanese had formed, which I didn't know about at the time, but there were 35 doctors. So what did Dr. Franklin, Captain Franklin, say? I'm now free, I'm not on duty any longer. But after 3 days, my men, who I knew all personally, said, could you be our doctor again, because you were more efficient in Nakamasi. And I was very, very pleased about this.
An American officer leads them from the plane, and the Jap surrender delegation is received with stern formality. Their chief, Lieutenant General Kawabe, and American Colonel Mashbeer, who almost gives a handshake this way. And negotiations in Manila that bring the surrender of Japan down to concrete facts. The delegates are empowered to take orders from General MacArthur, and credentials are presented.
Did you hate the Japanese?
Well, no, that's another story, because when I was quite young, aged 9, I had a row with my twin brother, and I didn't know what the row was about. But my father saw me trampling on his private little garden. We always had our own garden, which is strawberries. And I said, I hate Jack, I hate Jack. And my father just said, you must never, never use that word, hate. It does you harm, and it doesn't do any harm to the person. I feared the Japanese, but I didn't hate them. And in fact, right at the end, when we were finally released, a lot of people had psychological problems and so on. And I will say most of these were still living what they'd gone through and hating the Japanese. But when I got back, and you haven't asked me this question, I determined that I wasn't going to talk at all about my prisoner of war experiences. So my wife, and when the children came along, none of them knew anything about it, except that I'd been a prisoner of war until about 7 years ago.
And have you been lucky in terms of not developing post-traumatic stress, or have the psychiatric effects of being imprisoned affected you for the rest of your life?
I would like to say it hasn't affected me at all. No, when we arrived in Liverpool and got back, and the next day we were at, if you arrived at Southampton, you had a band meeting you and all sorts of Liverpool with a few club of children, and we threw them some oranges, which they'd never seen. But then the next morning, we had to see some woman who was going to give us a ticket so we could go take the train to our wives. But she said, "Now, what do you want to see a psychiatrist or a medical doctor?" And I said, "Neither. I want to see my wife." I'm lucky, as it were. I've done a job in a psychiatric hospital, but if I was in depressive mood or something like that, I might have all psychological problems. So I hope truthfully that, in fact, and it was the reason I wouldn't talk about my prison of war life when I got back. I forget it all, but now, of course, I talk about it quite a bit, including to you.
After the war, Dr. Frankland returned to work in the allergy department of St Mary's Hospital. But in 1979, he received a call from a rather unexpected patient, Saddam Hussein.
He's my most grateful patient I've ever treated in all my life. Well, I was doing outpatients one day at St Mary's Hospital, and they said, we want you to answer the phone. I said, "You know my rule, I never answer the phone when I'm seeing a patient." "Oh, this is an embassy." I said, "All right," I went and answered. Would I go to Baghdad that weekend to see an important patient? Anyhow, when I got there, I still didn't know who I was seeing or why I was seeing, but I did ask the doctor with me, who spoke perfectly, "Why have they asked me?" "Oh, well, this patient that you're about to see has got severe asthma and is allergic to fungal spores. And he's on injections for this, but he's going downhill." I went to see him and took his history, and I always remember I said to him, "He hasn't got asthma and he's not allergic to anything, but he's smoking. If he wasn't eating, sleeping or praying, he was smoking a cigarette, and that was over 40 cigarettes a day, and this was just ruining his chest." I know this nice doctor to begin with had said, "The reason you've been asked, you're the best allergist in Europe." And I said, "Oh, I'm very pleased to be described as such, but he's not allergic to anything, and the diagnosis is all wrong." Anyhow, I had a talk with him, and I said, "You're addicted to smoking, and I don't know that you're ever going to give it up. But if you don't give it up, you won't be head of the state in 2 years' time." Now, that was a silly thing to say, although it was true, you see. And he wanted all sorts of things. I said, "I'm treating you as a patient, not as head of the state." And I said, "I would treat a beggar in the same way." That's when perhaps I said the wrong thing, but he accepted this. And in about 3.5 months or so, we had this invitation, my wife, up to 5 children, and myself. And here was my very grateful patient to have lunch in the embassy. What happened when we had lunch, and I've never seen so much food in this place. He said, "Now, you've had a nice lunch for me that's my means of saying thank you. Tomorrow you can go shopping to my wife and buy anything you like at any shop, and I'll pay for it." That was my fee, as it were. I asked, well, could I have a watch? Because the Arabs are noted for having these very special and very expensive watches. "Oh, yes." Well, this can be arranged, and it was. I got this lovely watch, which I, of course, sold in Bond Street 2 or 3 months later.
So, Dr. Franklin, thank you very much for having me to sit in your, well, this is your office as well, it's not just where you live.
Yeah, and I sleep here too, of course.
Because you're still working, aren't you?
I'm still working. I'm determined to produce an article when I'm age 106. I've nearly finished writing it, but then of course it has to be accepted by a suitable journal and so on. But it's very interesting learning all sorts of new things about famous people that I've been involved with.